If you've watched or consumed any major sports content over the last 4 to 5 years, you may have noticed a once taboo subject become more and more prevalent in the industry. It's at a point where it's almost impossible to watch any major sporting broadcast without seeing ads from major companies for this once taboo subject. This previously underground industry suddenly became able to spend billions of dollars on advertising and shares the spotlight with some of sports' biggest events. So how did this all happen? Welcome to the business of sports gambling.
Make every coin toss feel like a Hail Mary. Make every free throw unmissable. Make every tackle, sack, drop, jab, hook, hit, steal, save, knuckle meet, air through, fly, ground ball, mean more.
We have fast payouts because Caesar is the man? Yes! Is that a thing? How is that even possible?
Sports betting was federally outlawed in 49 out of the 50 United States for most of recent history. This was due to a law passed in 1992 called the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. In this video, I will be referring to this as PASPA, or the PASPA Act. And yes, I know the last A stands for Act, but you're just going to have to deal with that. This bill was endorsed by former NBA player and Senator Bill Bradley. This law essentially outlawed all sports betting in the US, with Nevada being the one state exception. This bill was also supported by the NCAA and the 4 major sports leagues in the US, those being the National Basketball Association, NBA, Major League Baseball, MLB, National Football League, NFL, and National Hockey League, NHL. But this all changed just 4 years ago in 2018. So what happened in 2018 to cause this shift in opinion on sports gambling? In a case that was taken to the Supreme Court of the United States, everything changed when one state took on the federal government to pass their own gambling regulations. But before we get into that story, let's take a quick look at what happened before PASPA in 1992 and the history of sports betting in the US. If we start at the beginning, the first evidence of sports betting revolved around horse racing, and according to horseracing.com, the first racetrack was established in the United States in 1665, and the American Stud Book was put in place in 1868, one of the first American sports books, and by 1894, the American Jockey Club was set up. But due to a growing national anti-gambling sentiment in the early 1900s, bookmaking was banned. So the first recorded history of sports gambling goes back to the 1800s, and possibly it started earlier than that, as early as the 1600s, basically as old as the country itself. Anti-gambling sentiments began to spread in the US around the 1850s. Up to that point, it was running rampant and mostly unregulated throughout the country. By the early 1900s, there was a widespread ban on all gambling activity throughout the United States, not just sports. This was also around the same time as Prohibition. During this time, it led to a rise in underground and illegal gambling operations run by organized crime organizations. They're organized, they do crime, and they're organizations. This ban, however, did not last. Due to many factors, including the Great Depression, Nevada decided to legalize gambling around 1931. Although the state would not see much development until around the 1950s, once people realized there could be large profits in legitimate gambling enterprises, investors began to flock to the state. After the first domino fell, New Jersey was the next state to legalize gambling in Atlantic City in 1978. After that, riverboat casinos were legalized in multiple states in the 1990s. With the trend of gambling becoming more and more legal throughout the country, the federal government decided they needed to act against gambling to protect sport. And the PASPA regulation was passed in 1992, prohibited all betting on sports specifically. Now, what were the main arguments for why betting on sports should be illegal, and why did this act happen in the first place, as gambling in general in the United States was becoming progressively more legal? Now remember, the 4 major leagues and NCAA initially opposed legalized sports gambling. Their main argument was that sports betting compromised the integrity of the game. During the 1900s, there were multiple instances of sports betting, either underground or legal, that impacted how the players, officials, coaches, and other people involved in the game's integrity to have other motives other than fair play. Another reason that was mentioned by Bill Bradley himself in an article in 2017 was that he could foresee a future where betting on high school games was legalized, turning kids into poker chips instead of developing young human beings. Another article, written by Charles Pierce in 2017 and published on SportsIllustrated.com, cited that the main reason the leagues opposed sports betting was they wanted full control over their products and revenue streams. They did not like the idea of third parties making money off their product without them getting a share, so they did not want these sportbook companies making money off their sports. And then the last reason was the sentiment around gambling in general, amplifying potential consumer risks, consumer abuse, underage gambling, problem gambling, and money laundering. Now let's get back to how everything changed when New Jersey took on the federal government to legalize sports gambling. It all starts in 2011, so at this point, sports gambling had been outlawed by PASPA for almost 20 years. New Jersey voters approved a state constitutional amendment that would legalize sports gambling, which led to the Sports Wagering Act of 2012, allowing sports gambling at casinos and racetracks in the state. This law, signed by Governor Chris Christie, was opposed by the NCAA, NBA, NFL, NHL, and MLB in August 2012, arguing that it violated PASPA, even stating in paragraph 5 of a complaint in the lawsuit that, quote, gambling on amateur and professional sports threatens the integrity of those sports and is fundamentally at odds with the principle, essential to the success of plaintiffs, that the outcomes of a collegiate and professional athletic contest must be determined and must be perceived by the public as being determined solely on the basis of honest athletic competition. Plaintiffs have consistently opposed legalized sports gambling in other states and at the federal level because it undermines the public's faith and confidence in the character of the amateur and professional team sports. End quote. New Jersey was aware that the Sports Wagering Act violated PASPA, but argued that PASPA violated the 10th Amendment, which revolves around the federal laws and their ability to commandeer power away from the states. New Jersey argued that with the adoption of PASPA, the federal government has effectively hampered the right of New Jersey and the other states to decide how they will generate funds to pay for their budgetary items. The leagues brought this issue to court again, and the ruling was in their favor. New Jersey appealed this decision in September 2013, and the court ruled in the league's favor again. But due to a loophole in this most recent ruling, Governor Chris Christie passed a law in 2014 that repealed the original state law to ban sports gambling. This was an attempt to legalize sports gambling in the state. Again, the league sued New Jersey and won by decision. This all led to New Jersey fighting back once again and bringing the case to the Supreme Court. They requested examination of PASPA and anti-commandeering provisions against the 10th Amendment. And ultimately, in 2018, after 7 years and 3 lengthy lawsuits, the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision that the whole of PASPA was unconstitutional and it took power away from the states. And thus multiple states were able to legalize sports gambling. This story is not over with the legalization of sports gambling in just a few states. Since 2018, more and more states have legalized sports betting. And as of the making of this video, states like California have it on their ballots as a proposition for fall elections here in 2022. So with the massive emerging market of legal sports gambling, companies such as FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, Caesars, and more have taken full advantage of the removal of the PASPA regulation on sports gambling, and have devoted huge amounts of money to advertising to develop their services. So now it is common to see gambling ads during broadcasts even within the leagues that opposed it just a few years earlier. The key to why the Big Four leagues and the NCAA changed their outlook on gambling is tied to a loophole in sports betting. Fantasy sports is not considered sports gambling, which allowed companies like DraftKings and FanDuel to create platforms for sports-related money exchange and gain users. These companies have been invested in by some of the major leagues, their teams, and their partners for years, and it has allowed them to profit off of fantasy sports and sports betting. Sports gambling companies now have deals with major broadcasting networks. Turner Sports, which broadcasts the NBA, NHL, NCAA, and MLB, expects to make more than $400 million off sports betting commercials from DraftKings and FanDuel over the next 3 years. In a deal worth combined $1 billion, the NFL announced FanDuel, Caesars, and DraftKings as its official sportsbooks in April. Last month, the league added Fox Bet, MGM, PointsBet, and WynnBet as approved sportsbooks operators. The league's official TV partners CBS, NBC, Fox, and ESPN are able to sell up to 6 gambling-driven spots per game for advertising to those 7 brands. FanDuel, Caesars, and DraftKings spent a combined $314.6 million on advertising in 2021 versus only $84 million in 2019. DraftKings more than doubled its sales and marketing spending in the first 9 months of 2021 to $703 million, led by $303.7 million spent in just the third quarter. FanDuel had spent over $1 billion on marketing as of June 30th, 2022.
Advertising is based on one thing: happiness. And you know what happiness is? Happiness is the smell of a new car. It's freedom from fear. It's a billboard on the side of the road that screams with reassurance that whatever you're doing, it's okay. You are okay.
So where does the state of sports gambling stand now? 30 out of the 50 states now have legalized sports gambling, with that number continuing to grow since the repeal of PASPA in 2018. Ultimately, it's up to each individual state to determine its stance on sports gambling. Some of the largest markets, like California, still have some restrictions on legalized sports betting, but it's safe to assume that those regulations will change in the near future. With the current landscape, it's clear we'll be seeing sports gambling ads and sponsorships in the future with the way the law changes. So that's it for this story, and that's where it ends for now. I'm curious to know your thoughts on sports gambling. Is it good or is it bad for sports? Drop a like on the video if you learned anything, and subscribe to the channel. It helps tremendously. Thank you so much for watching.